It's a really great pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you, John, also for inviting me, and for the Women's Leadership Centre as well. There's great work happening here in Western Australia. There's great need as well. We're just talking about the fact that the pay gap here in Western Australia is still sitting at 27% in 2012. I mean, that's unbelievable. And people try to explain it away through mining, but no, it's something much more than that. And I think that's really an area that needs a bit of advocacy and focus. I do want to acknowledge that we're meeting on traditional lands here. And pay my respects to elders. I mean, one of the great things about my job is I get to meet with so many women and men all across this country. And I have to say, you know, I'm so inspired by the work of particularly Aboriginal women in demanding equality. They're strong, incredibly strong advocates. There's so much great work that's happening here in Western Australia, particularly when I work with 52 communities up in the West Kimberley. And to see the progress that's happening there is truly inspiring. So as Alison said, I came into my role in 2007. Some of you may have heard me tell this joke, but I came home to tell my son, my 12-year-old son at that time, I said, "Tom, hey, guess what? Mum's going to be Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner." Well, he just looked at me and said, "Mum, that is so gross," he said. He's 16 now, he kind of gets it, so... So my term was 2007 and was due to finish last month. And when I was reflecting on whether or not I would look to extend my term, I thought, you know, how many jobs can you go from 200 metres under the ocean to the UN, the World Bank, the Pentagon, the White House, all in the same month, and out to forward operating bases in Afghanistan? There are not many jobs that allow you to do that. And there are not many jobs that give you the privilege of working with so many groups that I work with, you know, from sex workers through to into boardrooms, women of faith, Defence Force personnel, migrant women, Aboriginal women, women with disabilities. I mean, it's just really a great privilege to be in this role. So I'm really happy to say that my term's been extended right out to 2014. But I did today want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing around sexual harassment in Australia. So to talk to you about the prevalence data, and to also talk to you a little bit about the review into Australia's Defence Force. And as Alison said, just a couple of weeks ago, actually it would be the end of last month, we launched the report Working Without Fear, results of a sexual harassment national telephone survey for 2012. This report is, and I'll just show it to you here, and it's available from our website. It is the third sexual harassment national telephone survey conducted by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And the survey examines the nature, the prevalence and reporting of sexual harassment in Australia, and particularly looking in Australian workplaces. And not only that, because we've done it 3 times, this is our third report, it tracks national trends in sexual harassment across the lifetime of the survey, beginning in 2003. The 2012 survey tells a very clear but disturbing story. Sexual harassment remains a common and ongoing occurrence in Australia, and particularly in Australian workplaces. And there has been little progress in the last 5 years in addressing this serious human rights violation. So I want to take a few minutes today just to share with you some of the major findings from the 2012 Prevalence survey, and then, as I said, to talk a little bit about the Defence Force. But before I do that, just to give you a history of the survey, the genesis of this survey was about a decade ago. So in 2010, the Commission undertook a review of all the complaints that it had received about sexual harassment, and it found that by far the vast majority emanated from the workplace. It also found that sexual harassment was a particular issue for women. But what the review didn't examine, though, was unreported cases of workplace sexual harassment, those instances of sexual harassment that occur in the workplace every day, but they're never formally reported. So in 2003, my predecessor, Prue Goward, she conducted the very first Australian national prevalence study. It was the only research of its kind, and to this day, the National Telephone Survey provides the only national and trend data on sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. And when I meet with counterparts from other countries, I realised just how important this study is. I don't know of many other countries that actually have prevalence data countrywide. But perhaps the most concerning finding of that 2003 survey was that sexual harassment was deeply embedded in many Australian workplace cultures, despite it being unlawful under federal anti-discrimination laws. And then in 2008, there continued to be emerging evidence. So at that time, I'd come into the role, I was there for a year, and I had undertaken a major listening tour all across this country, all across our country, talking to men and women about their lived experiences of gender equality. And I remember attending a focus group. It was in South Australia. I had about 14 young women. They were all the ages of 23, 24, either in their first or second jobs. And the vast majority of them could recount to me a situation which would, potentially constitute sexual harassment under Australian law. But it was when one woman said to me, she said, "Look, Liz, if my uncle does it, I know it's not okay. But if it's my boss or my manager, well, maybe that's just the way the workplace is, and I just have to get used to that." And, as a mum of a young daughter, that made me absolutely determined to understand what it is that we could do to change this picture in Australia. So the many and deeply personal stories I heard helped me to understand that the prevention of sexual harassment needed to be a key priority of my work as Sex Discrimination Commissioner. So in 2008, 5 years after Prue ran her first survey, I did the second one, and I wanted to know whether there'd been a reduction. I also wanted to know whether the awareness had improved. And as you can see here, what the 2008 showed us, the major finding was not just that sexual harassment remained a problem, but there was a lot of confusion about what sexual harassment actually was. So this year, I went on and repeated it for the third time. And part of the reason is I remember coming in as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and I'm quite divorced from the complaints side of the Human Rights Commission's activities. So we have a separate complaints department, and my role is more around advocacy, lobbying, law reform, policy changes. But I remember saying, no, I want to understand what are the issues that are happening at the coalface. So I'd meet regularly with complaints. I remember sitting in the first meeting and saying, right, that is it. I'm not buying any product or service from any organisation that I'm seeing coming up on the list. But I swear, after that first meeting, I thought, God, I won't be able to walk out my front door. I can't catch public transport, I can't eat, I can't go to the movies, doesn't matter what it was. Sexual harassment is ubiquitous across all sectors. So I went ahead and I did the 2012 survey, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. The other thing that I was determined to do this year was to see if I could get a male-dominated sector and put together some comparative research. So between the aggregate of Australian workplaces and a male-dominated sector. And the Australian Defence Force came on board and provided an opportunity to conduct a detailed industry-based analysis. It's the first time that I know of any country in the world where we have comparative data between a military in that country and the overall aggregate of workplaces. I'm not sure they knew what they were signing up to at the time, but good on them, I have to say, because it's not easy to open yourself up to such scrutiny. And they did this, I think, understanding that you can't fix a problem you don't know the magnitude of. And that's one of the things that I'm really calling for, is for other industries, whether it be the mining industry, financial services, retail, whatever, to have a good look and get the prevalence data for their particular industry. So what did the 2012 survey tell us? Look, we learned that sexual harassment is persistent and pervasive problem in Australian workplaces. 1 in 5, 21% of people over the age of 15. But when you break it down for men and women, 25% of women and 16% of men, which was a bit higher, have been sexually harassed in the workplace in the last 5 years. The gender gap is even starker if we look at the results of lifetime prevalence of sexual harassment. So what we found was that 1/3, 33% of women have been sexually harassed in their lifetime. By contrast, less than 1 in 10 men, or 9% of men, have been sexually harassed in their lifetime. So who are the harassers? Well, from a survey, we learnt that nearly 4 out of 5, so nearly 79% of harassers were men. 90% of women were harassed by a man, and 61% of men said they were harassed by a man. Interestingly, men harassing women by far accounted for the majority of harassment, sexual harassment in Australia, but I have to say there's an emerging group of male sexual harassment of men. We found there was a really significant increase. In fact, Proof found there was 7% of all harassment was men on men. In 2003, I found that it had grown to 23% of all harassment in Australia. And what is that about? We don't really have a quality of data that underpins it. This is very much a quantitative study. But what we might surmise, I suppose, is that it's the man who is sitting outside the dominant grouping in a particular workplace. So a workplace, the predominant male culture might be blokes love sport. Now, if you're the bloke that likes to read and you're sitting outside the tribe, then that potentially opens you up as more of a target for sexual harassment. Interestingly, we found that formal reports of sexual harassment are low. That follows all the research, and we found that only 20% of respondents who were sexually harassed in the workplace in the past 5 years ever brought any form of formal complaint. It's noticeably low, and the message to employers I always say is, look, if you're not hearing about it, believe me, it doesn't mean it's not happening. The fact is you won't hear about it. You need to actually put in place much more proactive strategies than that. So the other thing that we found is that there may be a correlation between the low rates of reporting and the significant number of people who reported that they'd experienced negative consequences as a result of making a formal report or complaint. So what we saw is the level of victimisation is increasing. It's almost at 30%. And by that victimisation, I mean that you're suffering some form of harm or detriment for exercising your rights under the Sex Discrimination Act, which is to make a complaint, whether it's internally or externally. And, you know, when I spoke to one woman, she said, look, Liz, why would I complain? I mean, in the military, they say career or complain. That's kind of the refrain when I go in there. But in other organisations, one woman said to me, she said, look, not only would I be the victim of the incident itself, but I would be the victim of bringing it to the attention of management. And, you know, this area is very much an area that as a country we need to take action on. The news isn't all bad though, because one of the most interesting and promising findings of a survey is that over half of all bystanders, and we defined bystanders as someone who either observed or became aware later on of a sexual harassment. So you won't find, I mean, we did a full, with Michael Flood and Paula McDonald from Queensland Uni and from Wollongong University. They did an analysis of bystander literature and literature review. There isn't much on bystander because often these things are happening behind closed doors. So that's why we had to extend out our definition of bystander. But where bystanders took action to prevent or reduce the harm of sexual harassment, the behaviour shut down much more quickly. In fact, 51% of all bystanders took some action, and that's a really significant number. Some of it was just supporting the target, other of it was actually making a complaint themselves. But for bystanders to take action, there needed to be a number of things in place. One is they needed to be working in an organisation where there was a zero tolerance policy toward, you know, a culture around sexual harassment. They needed to understand that when they spoke out, people would believe them as bystanders. And thirdly, they needed to know that they wouldn't be victimised as a bystander speaking out on these issues. And when I saw the finding, I was reminded of a story of a woman that I'll call Maria, who I met. She worked for a large company. She found herself a target of sexual harassment. She was fearful of the consequences of reporting the harassment, so she decided not to make a formal complaint to her employer. Instead, she remained silent. But when she learnt that the same man who had harassed her was harassing other women in the workplace, she decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. And she reported the harassment to her employer. And that's the other finding from a study. If it's happening to you, it's more than likely happening to someone else, because it speaks to a pocket or a culture which is tolerating sexual harassment. And in Maria's case, when her employer learnt about what was going on, it took swift action to put a stop to the behaviour. So in that case, kind of bystander intervention was an invaluable component of getting the behaviour to stop and actually ensuring that something was done. And in fact, those people who did bring complaints said that the behaviour often, or there was some action which was taken reasonably quickly. So that was another thing that was positive about the Australian study. If I can just now, though, turn to the review into the treatment of women in the Australian Defence Force. I mean, some of you may know that in April last year, there was an issue that arose in ADFA, which is the Australian Defence Force Academy, and the incident was called the Skype incident. And it involved 2 cadets, 1 male, 1 female, having consensual sex. What she didn't realise was that that incident was being Skyped to his mates in the room next door. This is still allegations and it's still before the court. But you may remember that at that time the Minister for Defence, Stephen Smith, came out with a number of reviews, and one of those reviews was to look at the current culture of not just ADFA but the ADF in relation to its treatment of women, and that was the review that I led. You know, before we actually started to go and have a look, people say, well, you know, you'll find out nothing. The Defence Force is, you know, shut down, locked up, no one's going to tell you anything. And I have to say our experience was probably the exact opposite. We had unprecedented access, not just to facilities but also to personnel. So I put together a review team, and we visited 36 military facilities across Australia, including Navy, Army and Air Force bases, training colleges, recruit schools. We went on exercises and demonstrations. We spent time underwater in submarines and above in frigates. We flew in Black Hawks and C-130 aircraft. We drove in tanks and armoured vehicles. We spoke to participants in all those different environments. We visited then a further 6 bases in the United Arab Emirates and Afghanistan. We spoke with troops in Kabul, Tarin Kowt, Kandahar. We were taken out to the forward operating bases to interview, which is out beyond the wire in Oregon province, in the mountains and valleys of Oregon province, to speak to troops who were really out past the front line. And overall, we spoke directly, one-on-one, with around 2,000 members of Australia's Defence Force, and we surveyed another 6,000 personnel. And as I said before, the ADF agreed to us using in one of the surveys the exact same methodology that we'd used for the National Telephone Survey. So for the very first time, we had comparative data. And I want to just talk to you a little bit about what that data showed. I also want to talk to you about how we made the case for change personal. So if I look at the ADF, I mean, the fact is, by its nature, if you're working in the ADF, it's an inherently, externally particularly, an unsafe work environment. It's a workplace involving inherent risks, I should say, rather than unsafe work environment. The ADF is a workplace involving inherent risks. But experiencing sexual harassment, bullying, victimisation and sexual abuse should never be one of these. Our review found that the reality is that sexual harassment and abuse does exist in the ADF today. In fact, when we went into the academy, ADFA, the military academy, our survey found that almost 72% of women had experienced low-level sexual harassment in the academy. By that, I mean things like the repeated telling of sexualised jokes, stories, intrusive questions about sex life, that type of thing. And we found that members frequently did not report these incidents. They feared they'd be victimised, their career would be jeopardised, they would not be believed, or that they'd be sometimes subjected to an unresponsive chain of command investigation. By no means was that the experience of everyone we spoke to. It absolutely wasn't. Many members said they'd never been subjected to discrimination or harassment, and they described the ADF as a very supportive and inclusive employer. And I have to say, I met some of the most impressive people I've ever met inside Australia's military. But because of inadequate and inconsistent data collection, it was difficult to obtain an accurate picture of the reported number of sexual harassment and abuse complaints. And that's what also assisted us put an urgent case for change. I mean, the military can't tell you how many rapes happen in the military every year. You know, and they themselves will say that's not, it's not a satisfactory situation. So then we went ahead, we undertook the National Telephone Survey, and the comparative data showed that the military, oops, sorry, it's not on that side, but the military, I'll just jump to here, is actually almost at exactly the same in relation to women. So 25% of ADF members have been sexually harassed in the workplace in the last 5 years, or 26% compared to 25%. It was almost comparable, which was quite a surprise, because when you read the media, it jumps from one sexual scandal to the next. But in fact, the data shows that there is comparable. And in relation to men, it was less in the ADF than in the general community. The most common forms in the ADF were sexually suggested comments or jokes that made you feel offended, intrusive questions about your private life or physical appearance that made you feel offended, inappropriate staring, leering that made you intimidated. And for men, the most common sexual harassment was sexually suggestive comments or jokes, sexually explicit emails or SMS messages, and once again, the intrusive questions. Additionally, 6.2% of women and 1.2% of men in the ADF reported experiencing inappropriate physical contact, which is more extreme, and 2.9% of women and 0.2% of men reported receiving requests for pressure for sex or other sexual acts. So I think the overall finding, though, is that the figures in the ADF, whilst not dissimilar to general findings in the national survey, they're still too high for any single workplace, because in a single workplace you have control over the complaints mechanisms, the education, those types of prevention strategies. And I think it was generally agreed by the ADF leadership that they should be better than the general aggregate of a general community. But I mean, I think it's important data, and they're going to work to build on that. But one of the things as we travelled round was often women would come to speak to us that here we were coming to the base, and it might be the first time they'd ever disclosed some of the issues that had happened to them, and it was for the very reasons that we talked about, the fear of victimisation and whatever else. And as I got on to that, during the year, and I was hearing quite a number of stories, and the stories were important so as the review we could understand the changes that were required, but it occurred to me that these stories are even more important to engage the hearts and minds of the ADF leadership, the people who need and have the power to create the change. And you'll agree with me, the ADF's one of the most reviewed organisations in Australia. It's subject to relentless media and community scrutiny. And I knew that delivering a compelling report by itself, and as John said, it's a very detailed report. And it's a report that's been picked up by our coalition partners across the world, which has been encouraging to see as well. But it's a very comprehensive and strong report. But delivering this was never going to be enough. I mean, this is just words on a page. So over the year, it became obvious to me that unless I could make the case for change personal, the level of engagement would not be sufficient to drive the reform agenda that's set out in that document. The query was, how could we make the case for change personal? And one of the strategies to do this involved the chiefs. So the Chief of Air Force, the Chief of Navy and the Chief of Army. Aided by magnificent women with compelling stories, what I did was I arranged for each of the chiefs of service to spend time standing in the shoes of the most vulnerable in their service, to look into the eyes of individuals who loved the ADF as much as they did, but for whom service had come at an unacceptable personal cost. And I remember making the call to the first chief, and I mean, this was a strategy that I could honestly say I'd never piloted, never done before, but I knew that without something like this, we weren't going to ensure that the reform agenda was sustainable. So what I did is I flew in women from all over Australia. These are the magnificent women that I'd met. Many of them came with their mothers. I arranged for them to bring a support person. And I said to the chiefs, you need to leave your military persona, your military clothes, everything at home. You're coming as someone to listen deeply to the stories of women, to understand at not just an intellectual and cognitive level, but at a deeply emotional level, what needs to change if we're going to make this military one which is inclusive of both men and women. And it was incredible. I mean, the chiefs would be able to hear, firstly, what extreme exclusion feels like. what it's like to be on exercise for 2 months when no one speaks to you, what it feels like to be sexually assaulted by your instructor, the very person in the chain of command whose role it is to look after you, the very person you go to for advice. And for the chiefs to sit opposite mothers who had encouraged their daughters into the service, mothers who believed that the enemy lay outside the military rather than within. And as I look back, I think these sessions that we had were the defining moments of our review. The courage of the women, and indeed the deeply committed approach of the chiefs, ensured that this actually made the case for change personal. And when I look back on the work that we did over the last year, I think this is some of the work that I'm most proud of. It's the work that reinforces to me that when you engage the head and the heart, that's when you get transformational change. And it was so rewarding to look up when the military did a press conference about accepting our report and agreeing to all the recommendations in there. The key message was that the Commissioner made the case for change personal. So we know that sexual harassment ruins lives, divides teams, and it damages organisational performance, or in the case of the ADF, it's about operational effectiveness. That, you know, you can run a strong human rights argument in the ADF. Some people understand that, others don't. I prefer to run the operational effectiveness in capability type of argument, because that speaks to whether or not we want the most operationally effective defence force that we can possibly have. So sexual harassment destroys that. What do we need to do to make a real difference? Well, I think generally if we look across Australia, we need a greater focus on prevention strategies. And one of the parts that's missing from that, I think, is a highly visible community education campaign. Many people still don't get what sexual harassment is. Is it about flirting in the workplace? Is it about dating? No, it's not about any of those things. It's about unwelcome conduct. So what is that? So I think that's a missing piece, and I'm talking to the unions and the employers, and I have to say that was great to see the unions and employers come together with me. So Linda White, the Deputy Head of the ACTU, and Peter Anderson, the Head of ACCI, to actually launch this and say, actually, this is something we all care about together. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we need to improve access to confidential workplace reporting mechanisms. They need to be easily accessible, they need to be safe places, and they need to be transparent. People have to understand what happens when they go and report and make a complaint, because often the whole thing just runs away from you at that point. So there needs to be a better focus on that. Thirdly, we need to arm a wide range of people in workplaces with the knowledge and skills to support and advise those who are experiencing sexual harassment, because one of the things the survey showed is that we don't go to the contact officer or the equity and diversity officer often. We speak to others in the workplace, so we need a wide range of actors who understand it. Fourthly, we need to encourage and empower bystanders, and we talked about, you know, the positive things that happen when bystanders step in. And finally, we need more industry-based research, which I talked about before. The ADF was one sector, but I want to expand that out. In relation to the military, what have they done as a result of our work around sexual harassment? Our work was much more extensive than sexual harassment, sexual abuse. We looked at the whole trajectory for women in the military. But in relation to sexual assault, sexual misconduct, they've immediately moved to set up SEMPRO, which is the Sexual Assault Misconduct Prevention Office, which will report straight to the Chief of a Defence Force. It will have a much more effective prevention and education role, and it will be grounded in sexual ethics and respectful and healthy relationships. It'll be about centralising all the data collection so we can say how many sexual harassment, sexual abuse happens in our military every year, and so that trends can be monitored and appropriate action put in place, and it'll be very victim-centric. Only by elevating the status of sexual misconduct, harassment and abuse to the highest level will these issues be consistently and systematically treated with the seriousness that they demand. All of us, all women and men, irrespective of our workplaces, must be able to work without fear. Because after all, being safe at work is a basic human right. Thank you very much.
Janice Dudley, Murdoch University. I'd like to thank you very much, Commissioner, for your presentation this morning, and also the work that you're doing and the work of the Human Rights Commission with respect to this issue of gender and sexual harassment. Impressive research, and really good that you've got the people at the top. But I think we all know that a deeply embedded workplace culture means that you can have tremendous resistance at that middle management level. Middle management is extremely effective at subverting, ignoring, and just not doing anything about what comes from the top. So I'd be very interested in, and I think that's a really hard one, but I'd be very interested to know what sorts of strategies you consider to be appropriate and what sort of advice the Commission would be giving to organisations about how to ensure not only that we're getting awareness at the highest strategic level, but we're also getting it, if you like, at the middle management tactical level.
It's such a great point, and particularly when I look at the military, which is the industry that I've looked at in most detail over the last year. I mean, if you don't get the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, who are really the cultural ambassadors in that organisation, it doesn't matter what the top says. At the end of the day, that's the person who's my boss. And if they act in a particular way in relation to women, then that's what I've got to do to actually succeed. We tried to get at that in a number of ways in that particular organisation. One was very much to tie any form of promotional prospect to a much wider definition of performance. So, for example, for commanding officers, also NCOs, what we recommended there was that there be a climate, what we call a climate survey, but their staff, the people they're commanding, be asked to contribute a couple of times a year on a variety of issues, including these issues. So they're built in a systemic or in a very regular and systematised way, so that their promotional prospects depend on how they're doing on some of these areas, how they're managing flexible work, how they're managing the issues around sexual harassment, their own behaviours, and those types of things. Because unbelievably, at this, the good CEOs, commanding officers and NCOs are already doing this. The ones that aren't are the ones that definitely need to. So that was one of the things, so to actually build it in at that level. The other thing is, I mean, it is about education at some level, but what we found was, depending on what happened in the recruit school, that was being taken out then more widely to the service. So we've got a real focus on recruit schools and sexual ethics training, so highly participatory sexual ethics training there, because when we went and had a really good look at that, it was death by PowerPoint. This is a legal definition of sexual harassment. This is what you shouldn't do. Does everyone get that? Okay, right, move next. So that really changing a lot of the education that happened. And then the third thing was for us was about setting up SEMPRO. Now SEMPRO, because one of the things, we spent quite a bit of time in the Pentagon looking at the US military. US military has about 20,000 rapes a year, of which 10,000 are men. We looked at what they'd done more recently, and they'd moved to what they call a restricted reporting regime. And that is where I can, if I'm sexually assaulted, I can either report up my chain of command, which is how we do it in Australia, or I have the option to give what's called a restricted report outside the chain of command. So they have type, text or call, and even up in Afghanistan, when I was out on those out on the bases, Tarin-Kowt and others, or Kabul particularly, because it's a shared base, in Kandahar, every toilet you went to, it was, if you've experienced this, this is what you do, call this number, text or type. There you immediately get onto someone, who understands sexual assault, sexual harassment, and the nature of trauma. Those people who staff their equivalent of SEMPRO have 16,000 hours of trauma counselling and everything else. So you get to someone who understands what you're going to be talking to them about for a start. But secondly, you can say, I don't want an investigation. What I want is access to medical support, counselling support, maybe some forensics, but I don't want to go further. Now, what they found was when they did that, the levels of reports increased over 100%. So, which just speaks to the very issues we're talking about. We don't speak out because we fear victimisation. The only trouble, I suppose, with it is, what if I'm the third person who goes in who says, I don't want to do anything about it, and then it becomes clear that we've got a predator on the base. So we've recommended a restricting reporting regime for the ADF. It's a bit problematic under Australian law because of vicarious liability provisions under the Act and all those types of things. The military are looking hard at it because the reality is those predators are still on base. You're not hearing about it because no one's speaking out about it. At least if you went to a restricted reporting regime as an interim model, that could take us a bit further up. But so they've accepted that recommendation in full. I know they're having a very difficult time working out how it's going to play out, but at least it would be a safe place for both women and men, because I have to say I met men in our military who've been sexually assaulted as well. So it's a really important step.
Hi Liz, thank you. I'm wondering if there's any data by age group on harassers, because in, I don't know, just from my own personal experience, it seems to be an older age group that tend to have the less knowledge about what constitutes sexual harassment. Is there any data on that?
Yeah, there is. I think they're between 30 and 50 often, most harassers. What we found was that you're most likely to be harassed by a co-worker. And so that's both men and women. Having said that, women are 5 to 6 times more likely to be harassed by a boss than a man is. Now, does that speak to the fact that there are less women at senior level? We just don't know, but that's what the research is showing. But the profile of harasser, 7 out of 8 are male, and they're between the ages, I think, of 30 and 50, most likely. We're in detail here, but I'm pretty sure it's that. But having said that, I have to say that because of the ubiquitous nature of it, there are, people outside those age ranges as well. You're most likely to be the victim of sexual harassment if you're a young person. You're under the age of 40. So, and particularly those in the age group 18 to 24.
Thank you very much. It's Glenda Scully from Curtin University. I was wondering if you could draw the distinction for us between harassment and bullying, and whether or not I'm not sure if you can answer this, whether we observe the same gender patterns in bullying as we do with harassment.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I suppose I principally look at sexual harassment, so it's a very particular form of harassment. It's quite an extreme form of harassment. So rather than general harassment and bullying, and when we look at the Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, the conduct that is regulated specifically is sexual harassment. Is general bullying different? I just don't have the data to say whether it is or not. I think the patterns of behaviour of sexual harassment and general harassment and bullying are probably reasonably similar. And increasingly now we're seeing harassment, or sexual harassment through email, sexting, pornographic videos, social media. They're a new kind of form and medium for sexual harassment. I mean, when I see them come in the Commission, I just still think, how dumb are you? I mean, we don't have the evidentiary issues of a he said, she said when people just open up. And we've seen, things like that. We've seen a number of cases. I'm not referring to any particular ones, but just even over the last 6 months. I mean, if people don't get that, then there is no hope, I think. But yeah, as to whether they follow a similar pattern, I just don't have evidence to say that. The Commission generally is doing more work on bullying. We've got a kind of unifying theme that all commissioners are working towards, which is the elimination of bullying, harassment and violence. For me, that's against women in those circumstances. For Graham, it'll be about people with disability or Indigenous or different races or whatever. Yeah, so sorry I can't give you a better answer than that.
Hi, I'm Melinda Italiano from Penrose College, which is a all-girls school not far from the city. One of the biggest problems we have, and not just at our school but schools all over, is what is considered to be normal in terms of, I guess, sex and what, you know, the social media and the fact that it's constant. You know, they don't realise that they are harassing other people when they comment on photos and put photos up of themselves. And that's a massive concern because young boys and girls have no idea that they are actually harassing. So what are the plans? What can we do to change that?
It does have to be about education. Oh, look, I absolutely agree with you. I've got a 14-year-old, she's being 15 next week. And, you know, when I look at the Facebook pages, she's on Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook. You know, I'm busy. I can't have a day job. I'm too busy following around on these social media sites saying, get that photo down. You're right, because they don't, and the casualisation of communication as well. And I think that's possibly when we talk about sexual harassment by co-workers in organisations, it is the casualisation of the communication in the workplace as well. I mean, I say to Lucy, I say to people that I see in workplaces who ask me, well, where's the grey line? I say, listen, if you're feeling in doubt, if in doubt, do not do it. If you followed that basic rule, I think we'd be all better off. But it has to be about education. And one of the most exciting things the Human Rights Commission's working on at the minute is we're working with a national curriculum. So with ACARA. So we've input into geography, history, English, maths, in terms of not just the respectful relationships piece, because that's what it's about, respect at the heart of every interaction, whether it be online or in face-to-face, but it's also about changing the stereotypes around men and women. So, you know, men in caring roles, women in technical roles, those types of things. And there's some really great work being done through our community education group around that. So I live in hope for that. That's going to be a bit late for my daughter and son. But I think, you know, unless we start, a lot of things that we see play out because we have particular attitudes, we hold attitudes that are formed early on, you know, even from ages 3 or 4, and particularly around gender. I mean, from the minute we put our feet on the ground, we're looking around, right, what's mum doing, what's dad doing, what are the women in my life doing, men in my life, and we develop our gender schema, which is deeply embedded belief system about the relations between men and women, and to try and undo that later on is very, very difficult. So any work that we can do in an educational sense from kindergarten all the way up, I think it's got to be a positive.
Terrific presentation. Rosemary Sayer, writer and business communications consultant. To follow up to that question, I wanted to ask you from your experience, it seems to me, for want of a better word, the narrative about how we talk about things in business and in society has changed dramatically, and I think most people in this room would be aware of, without getting political, what's happened to our Prime Minister, and if you haven't, read the Ann Summers recent speech. I was sitting at the Duxton waiting for Hillary Clinton and the motorcade to go past, and a bloke who looked like an average sort of bloke who's sitting in this room today said, why does the silly bitch need that much security? Have you noticed in your role as Commissioner just a change in narrative? And obviously it goes back to education, but it just seems to me that the narrative about gender has changed dramatically.
I mean, I do think it's stalled. Have we got worse? I'm not sure. But I think our progress towards gender equality in Australia has stalled. I think the really heightened national conversation around sexism and misogyny, I think that's been positive. It's at least... and, you know, people will be dismissive of it. It's fascinating to see what people outside Australia think about it. And I sit on the gender board of the World Bank, where we're investing in women and girls programs all around the world. And I was up at their board, the bank had their board meetings up in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, there was a real buzz there about the fact that Australia's Prime Minister had actually stood up and raised this issue. And, you know, that wasn't it great that Australians were able to have a conversation about this? Because I think when your most senior people do that, that gives licence for other people. And I see that with our Male Champions of Change strategy. It's a strategy that I started about 2 years ago now, and it's really off the back of the research which shows that if we want fundamental change, we need men taking the message of gender equality to other men. That's what's going to change the picture in Australia. So at that time I I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go out and get some of Australia's most powerful and influential men. So I went out to, head of Qantas, the head of Woolies, the head of Commonwealth Bank, the head of ANZ, and now I've brought in a whole host of others. So the head of an army, the head of a Prime Minister's department, Martin Parkinson, the head of the Treasury, the head of Rio Tinto and whatever. And we came together again yesterday. We meet 4 times a year, and it's really about committing not just to individually drive change in my organisation, but to be prepared to stand up and be a national advocate on these issues. And it was great. The last 3 months, those men have spoken at 30 events. So that's, if we that running rate, that'll be 120 events over the year. But most importantly, they're speaking out. One of them travelled with me to Washington. We've been to Rio, to Jordan, to Dubai. So they're taking the message externally as well. And it's a strategy that emerging economies are really loving. We're getting requests from Turkey, across South America, across Africa, particularly economies where there are no women to advocate. So unless men advocate for women's leadership, then there won't be any progress. But why I'm telling you this story is that one of the most interesting things that's happened in the 2 years in these, and now we've got 25 champions of change in their organisations. When I run into women and men that work there, they say to me, what that strategy has done has legitimised the conversation in our organisation. So now I know I can raise it. The CEO's out talking about it all the time. I know I can start to have a conversation. And I think, that's been a significant cultural shift. So watch for the male champions because they're doing some really innovative stuff around their game changers, so big, bold things which only CEOs could do, sitting on top of large supply chains and those types of things. And they'll be releasing all their data. They're running 24 monitored experiments, and they'll be releasing the data behind that in August next year. So I think it'll be really interesting.
Thanks. Sue Fife from Curtin University. Yes, thank you. That was fascinating. And I'm just interested in the issue that you raised about the lack of understanding of what sexual harassment is, and whether there's an issue of semantics here. Just like your comment, we talk about gender equality, but we talk about sexual harassment. And I'm just wondering whether it's the term that leads to the misunderstanding, the use of the word sexual, versus in other areas we use the word gender when we talk about equality. Could you just comment on that?
Yeah, it is interesting. Because I suppose in when we look at what sexual harassment is, and in the survey, we picked it up in the 2008 survey, because Prue in 2003, how the survey worked is the social marketing or social research people read out the definition of what sexual harassment was and then asked the question, have you ever been sexually harassed? And it went from there. We found that when we asked that question, so we said, look, sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature which offends, humiliates or intimidates, and it's reasonably anticipated that the target would feel that way. When we asked them, have you been sexually harassed? Oh, no. And they say, okay, can I ask you some behavioural-based questions? Have you ever received unwelcome, repeated unwelcome, sexually explicit emails, texts, this and that? Oh, yeah, no, that happens every day. Have you ever experienced unwelcome corning, kissing, hugging? Oh, yeah, no, the boss always when he comes in. So that made us help understand that actually there's a huge disconnect. In fact, over 20% of those that said no to sexual harassment then went on to define, to speak about environments where there clearly was sexual harassment. But I suppose, if we were to talk about gender-based harassment, which is I'm harassed because I'm a woman, or a man, you're right, I'm harassed because I'm a woman or a man, I suppose particularly in a feminised workplace, where it would definitely extend out the net. Because sometimes we know that there is harassment. It's not sexual in nature, but it actually has to do with our sex or with our gender. That's possible. You know that the federal anti-discrimination laws are currently all being reviewed, and the government's driving what they call a consolidation project. That is, they're going to bring all the acts together in one act, which will be an overall consolidated act or equality act. So we haven't seen the exposure draft yet. It's to be released any day. It's been to be released any day for quite a few days. But so I think it would be interesting to keep an eye on that to see whether any of those definitions are widened as well, because I do think it does lead to confusion, and therefore, it's not as effective as it could be. Mm.
Thank you. Jonathan Smith from Anson. Something you mentioned before, you mentioned your daughter, and that really resonated me as a parent, as a father of 2 young daughters. Do you have any tips, parent to parent?
Jeez, I would like you to give me a few.
But, you know, for me, particularly as a father of daughters, what I could do to help them, you know, so that when they grow up and they face these sort of issues, maybe they can minimise the impact on themselves.
Yeah.
Or learn how to deal with them better.
I think you're absolutely right. Being forewarned is forearmed, and that's one of the reasons that a number of my male champions agreed to come into the group was, I mean, one in particular, the head of IBM, has twins, one's a son and a daughter, and the idea that his daughter wouldn't be able to live the expectations that she had for her life was just so appalling to him that he's absolutely one of the most determined to do something about that. And I think is firstly, as a dad, understanding these issues, so engaging in conversation with your daughters about that, but also modelling that men can be great at caring and domestics as well as paid work, mum, you know, so that there's a much less rigidity around the gender lines that happen in your house. I mean, if there was one thing I could do as Sex Discrimination Commissioner to really progress gender equality in this country, it would be the better sharing of paid and unpaid work between men and women. So I think, you know, anything that you do around that as well, I mean, that's fantastic. And I mean, what works well in my house. My kids have got the idea that, you know, washing, cleaning, drying, ironing, what is dad's job. Go kids. The only trouble is my daughter's really lazy as a result of that. She refuses to do anything, whereas my son's running around busy, you know, doing this or that. But so that's probably not the right strategy either. But I do think just coming along to things like this, understanding it, and you know, because like all of us, we want both our sons or daughters, doesn't matter, you know, who they are, but to have the same opportunities and for their gender not to be a limiting factor in their lives. So good on you for coming. And actually, for men, I think advocacy as well, standing up and talking to other men about this, because that's one of the other things that men in the champions organisations talked to me about. They said before our CEO started talking about, we didn't have any mechanism as men to talk about these things. I think that's right, there isn't. I mean, we women talk about it all the time, but there's not a mechanism for men to talk about it, so I think that's another thing as well.
Hi, I'm Daniela Kambaskovic from the University of Western Australia. And I first of all wanted to thank you for this amazing presentation that really got me thinking not only about sex discrimination and sex harassment, but also about other forms of gender discrimination that we encounter in the workplace. And I don't know if this is the right place to raise this, but I really feel that I want to, because these strategies that you have listed there on this PowerPoint right now, I feel could contribute considerably to changing the negative attitudes that I've noticed in my workplace as a former manager in the Federal Public Service who's come to an academic career later in life, around issues surrounding maternity leave and discrimination on the basis of being a young mother or a mother of a young baby, not so young, but mother of a young baby, in a contract situation. In fact, I've noticed that the better the university's policies are on paper, the less...
Oh, really?
The less willingness there is on the ground to recognise that there's any kind of problem. Even if you advance every possible piece of evidence, it seems to me that any kind of complaint or criticism, however well-based or well-founded, will be perceived as an attack on the fantastic image that this university has in the wider community, rather than... Thank you all very much. But, I was quite scared to raise this because we really don't have a mechanism, particularly contractual staff, who... another thing I wanted to say is that the better the policies are, for tenured staff, the more dangerous they in fact are for contractual staff, because every policy that affects a tenured staff member has a cost attached to it. And so a contract staff member, in order to uphold those policies in relation to a contractual staff member as well, you face a cost that you can evade if you just simply hire another person who doesn't have children. So while the staff agreement in our organisation says no one can be ever dismissed on the basis of the fact that they've had a baby, the same staff agreement also says you can in fact allow the contract to lapse lawfully and hire someone else. So until we actually fix those legislative points, we can't have real change, because the university is within its legal rights to dismiss you if you've had a baby, in effect. Not in the words of the law, but in the spirit of the law. And another thing is that the policies constantly talk about equality, a fair workplace, a family-friendly workplace. However, it is very rare in my experience, and I don't know if staff here are aware of this, to have a mother of young children with full-time teaching responsibilities in an early career situation actually compared like with like. So you're constantly compared with single men in terms of the research performance with no family duties, and I have 2 young children, one of whom is a year-old baby, or you're compared with staff who are women with children but have no teaching responsibilities. You're never compared with a woman staff member with 2 young children who has full-time teaching responsibilities and who is in a contractual situation with an associated level of insecurity.
Yeah,
so it's not always, I think, at our university, because it employs intellectuals. Sex discrimination, sex harassment of this type is not condoned. But discrimination when it comes to anything that affects research performance is incredibly rife, and there's nothing you can do about it at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because universities, I think, are behind the pack in this area. I mean, my 2 sisters, one's a professor of medicine and one's, she's a doctor, sports medicine physician, but she's also does a lot of work in research. And, when I look at just even the grants and things like that, they haven't been available in a part-time, on a flexible work basis. Those types of just really basic things are just not there. When I look at the GA universities and then below that, there's no targets to be set for the number of women at professorial level, the number of women at decision-making level within the organisation, just the basic things that have happened in other contemporary workplaces in Australia. And I mean, that would, I think, around universities, because when you look at contracts, insecure work, I think 40%, Jed Kearney says 40% of Australia's workforce is in technically insecure work, whether it's a contract, labour hire, whatever it is. The vast bulk of those people are women. So when it's about negotiation and whatever, it is very, very difficult. I think you will see some movement on that because issues like pregnancy discrimination are ones that are coming up on our radar. They're coming up on the union's radar. And when I say pregnancy, I don't just mean when you are pregnant, but potential pregnancy and return to work, because they're the types of issues that you're talking about there. I think you will see some activity in that area. Kind of just watch this space and we'll see what happens.